This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the more than 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Here's how I pick my numbers when I play the new Pick 5 from the Virginia Lottery. I call it the Wheel.
Win up to $50,000.
I've got all the numbers on here, plus one extra slot where my wife gets to pick the number.
5 numbers, 0 through 9.
Babe, what'll it be?
Burger and fries, please.
No, I meant the Wheel.
The what?
How you choose is up to you. Play in-store, in-app, or online today. Visit VALottery.com/pick5.
This podcast contains explicit language. If you want to know how explicit, keep listening. Hi, I'm Josh Levin, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of July 24th, 2023. On this week's show, The Athletic's Steph will join me to talk about the U.S. women's national soccer team's opening victory at the Women's World Cup and the big storylines at the tournament thus far. Jonathan Clegg, the author of the book Messi vs. Ronaldo, will also be here to talk about Lionel Messi's crackling MLS debut. And finally, the Wall Street Journal's Jason Gay will assess the 2023 Tour de France and the Netflix documentary Tour de France Unchained. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. And joining from Brooklyn is Hang Up producer Kevin Bendis. Kevin, I need someone to banter with this week. The Yankees stink. How about that? Can we banter about that?
Disagree. They just swept the Royals. They're back in it.
Traditional Yankees farm team, the Kansas City Royals, just helping us get right and restore the balance of power. I saw, I don't know if it's maintained, but the AL East is like kind of in reverse order of payroll. Orioles, Rays at the top. And then
I didn't realize that, but I guess that makes sense.
I also didn't realize how much the Blue Jays were spending on players, like over $200 million.
Yeah, I guess everyone's spending a lot, but the top spenders are sadly in the bottom. But everything will be reversed shortly. I guarantee it.
All right. Take that to the bank. Stefan Fatsis is on the disabled list this week, but he will be back imminently. Get well soon, Stefan. And don't forget to get your tickets to Slow Burn Live in Washington, D.C., starring our own Joel Anderson. It's this Tuesday night at the Hamilton, and you'll get a bunch of great interviews from Joel. You'll get an interview of Joel, and you'll get some original storytelling from Joel about sports and Clarence Thomas. You will not want to miss it. I will be there. To get tickets, it's slate.com/slowburnlive, slate.com/slowburnlive, and there's a discount for Slate Plus members. In our bonus segment for Slate Plus members this week, the Wall Street Journal's Jason Gay will tell us the inspiring story of how he overcame his addiction to sporting goods. Maybe he can help you overcome yours. To hear that conversation, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get bonus segments on this show, on Slow Burn, on other Slate shows. You get to listen ad-free. You get unlimited reading on the Slate site, and you get to support us. Slate.com/hangupplus, slate.com/hangupplus. On Saturday in New Zealand, the United States women's national team got its World Cup underway with a 3-0 win over Vietnam. Considering that the U.S. led in shots 28-0, it was a valiant effort by Vietnam to keep it that close. But other than Sophia Smith, who had a brilliant World Cup debut with 2 goals and an assist, the U.S. did not look super duper sharp. But hey, it's a long tournament, at least if you keep winning. Joining me now from the Women's World Cup is Steph. You can read her in The Athletic and listen to her on the Full-Time podcast. Steph, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on. Good morning from Melbourne.
What are your takeaways from that opening win against Vietnam?
I honestly thought it was fine. My questions came at the start when we saw things like Julie Ertz starting, Savannah DeMello starting. They're both kind of Julie Ertz is being reintroduced into the setup. Obviously, she's a veteran player, but you don't know until you know, right, when you're in a tournament. And this was Savannah DeMello's second cap ever for the United States. And I thought they both did fine. The team looked like it was ticking okay. like you noted, it was, a little disconnected in places, but in a lot of spots, a lot of trouble areas, like Rose Lavelle, like, was she going to be fit? She came in. Yeah, she was fit. So I honestly, this game soothed a lot of my specific worries about the team.
Sophia Smith, I think, was the big hope for this team, NWSL MVP, 22 years old, in her first World Cup, and she more than lived up to those expectations in this first game.
Yeah, she popped off. That combo of her and Alex Morgan was looking really, really good. Alex Morgan's role increasingly has been the player who gets beat up so that everybody else around them can score, just because she draws so much attention. And indeed, she drew a lot of attention. But within that pressure, she and Sophia Smith were looking to each other to play off of each other. And with that connection already looking pretty strong, I was like, okay, this is some confidence going on here.
The first goal, Lindsey Horan to Morgan with the flick on to Smith, was beautiful. I mean, I haven't watched every game, but I haven't seen a goal prettier than that in the World Cup so far. Depending on your perspective, it either shows a lot of potential or it shows what was missing from the rest of the game, which certainly did not look that beautiful. But that was quite a moment.
It was kind of the culmination, it was the promise delivering, right, of all the work that they've been doing. And then just bing, bang, boom. I thought it did put a little stamp on, you cannot count Lindsey Horan out on this team. When you look at the statistics, I won't go too deep into the numbers. FIFA's technical group is pumping out a lot of numbers around this tournament, which is actually great because it means they're investing resources in the women's technical side. But that aside, if you look at her numbers, she is a very important player in the U.S.'s build-up possession and how they connect to each other. Makes sense. She's in the center of the field. But you look at that and you're like, oh, she was pretty important here for this team to function. So I thought that, that put a nice little exclamation point on that.
And you mentioned it in one of your first answers, but for me, the thing that actually made me the most optimistic going forward was seeing Rose Lavelle and also Megan Rapinoe come in and kind of change the game. It didn't necessarily result in goals, but you're just like, oh yeah, that's Rose Lavelle. She has this sort of skills and creativity in the midfield that nobody else in this team really has. And I thought Rapinoe's crosses actually looked quite good. She looked like a dangerous player in her limited minutes. And so, having them come off the bench and hopefully as the tournament goes on playing bigger minutes seemed to me okay, there's a lot more firepower here than maybe we saw in the first 60 minutes of this match.
Yeah, I think, again, with Rose Lavelle, just to continuing the reassurance. So the physical data that FIFA's pumping out, her top speed was 30.1 kilometers per hour. She was one of the faster players on the team. And for comparison, for Americans, I think that's roughly something like 18 miles per hour, that the top speed that she hit. So if you think about it, that's kind of as fast as someone will bike, at a normal time. So, it seems physically, at least, her body feels like it's ticking. It seems to be. Again, very reassuring.
All right. Well, there will be much more to say after the game against the Netherlands, which is Wednesday night Eastern time here in the U.S. But I wanted to move on to kind of other Women's World Cup topics while we have you here. And first of all, this is a very broad question, but what are the vibes? You're there. You're in Australia right now. It's kind of hard to get a sense just because so much of the action is happening in the middle of the night for us here. But what's the kind of talk around the tournament in the country?
Attendance seems to have been really good pretty much at all the games, which is not a given during group stage because even for the men's tournament, there's just so many games going on that inevitably, one random game, not that it feels random to the team that's in it, but just, some of the games, it's okay, this one's not going to be the hugest draw, so maybe the stadium's only a half or 2/3 full. That's what happens in group stage. So far, the vibes have been pretty good. At least here in Melbourne, they're playing at Amy Park, or for FIFA purposes, because you're not supposed to use brands, Melbourne Rectangular Stadium. And There's a lot of signage around. I saw here at Fed Square, which is downtown in the central business district of Melbourne, they have a FIFA store and a fan zone there. I walked by on a random night. England was about to play Haiti. The store was like making money hand over fist. So the presence has been okay. I always want to see more, right? I would have loved to see the local organizing committees like really, really splash World Cup stuff all over Melbourne. But from what I've seen and what I've felt, it's been a good vibe. Obviously, this is a country that loves sports, and it's also a country that loves the Matildas, even if soccer is kind of like, it's like the two types of football, or rugby, maybe as we would call it, and then soccer. But the Matildas are quite beloved in this country. And when they come to Melbourne for their last group game against Canada, I think I'm really going to get to experience like the vibes plus.
Yeah, and it's got to be great for the tournament that Australia and New Zealand both won their opening games. Host countries always do well in World Cups, but even so, I think the New Zealand victory was a surprise. Has the addition of these, now that we have 32 teams, 8 countries making their World Cup debuts, including Vietnam, for me, from a viewership perspective, it seems like those countries are mostly kind of holding their own and showing that they belong. You mentioned Haiti. I thought it was just a remarkable performance from them, and one where they deserved more out of the game than a 1-0 loss. But I don't know if it was Haiti or if any of these other countries have really stood out to you, and kind of how you feel about having them in this World Cup.
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head, noticing that, there's a lot of teams this tournament that have kind of been pushing back against this idea, like they're still developing. I think they are still developing, but they're showing like we made it to this stage and we're ready to compete here. So you had South Africa. They went up earlier on Sweden, even though they ultimately didn't win the game. You had Jamaica really putting up a heck of a fight against France. Vietnam held the United States to 3-0. I think some of that was the U.S. getting in their own way a little bit, but Vietnam never looked like deflated by the scoreline. I think that was a game that could have been maybe 5 or 6-0, and it wasn't. There's a lot of energy here ahead of Germany and Morocco, where Morocco's team captain flat out said, we're not here to make up the numbers. We're here to compete. Like, they might be the first Arab nation to qualify for a women's World Cup, but they're not coming here just to be like, oh, thanks for having us. They're coming here to get a result.
And you've written a bunch about issues the teams have had with their federations and challenges that a lot of these countries have had in terms of resources and opportunities. And I guess there's a risk when teams come to the World Cup and maybe put up a good performance to just be like, oh, like, they're great. They're doing so well. And losing some of these stories about whether it's, coaches abusing players, federations abusing players, players not getting paid. Do you feel like these stories are getting aired? And are there any in particular that you think it's important for folks to know about?
Yes. Before this tournament started, over at The Athletic, we compiled a list of every country that going into the tournament had some kind of issue with their federation that we could find. And it was a very long and depressing list. Prominently among them, which is something that I think all of us have been trying to look into, but the tournament puts teams into a bubble and then like communication kind of starts to shut down, is Zambia, where there was an allegation that their head coach, Bruce Mwape, had, committed some kind of sexual misconduct with a player or players. And so when you watch those games and you think about that context of the like players having to perform under that kind of pressure, I don't want to discount obviously other teams having, like, even England is having a dispute with their FA over bonuses that was not resolved by the time that they had played their first game. Canada, another team in a dispute with their federation that has triggered parliamentary oversight, a government level inquiry. But yeah, the Zambia one was one where we kind of have the least information, sadly, just because I think it is such a sensitive topic and it's very hard to get people to talk about something like that. Especially with the tournament, you can't blame any player for going into this and going, this happens once every 4 years. And then especially, Zambia, maybe they're thinking like, CAF, the African Confederation, it was pretty tough. Qualifying, it's a region where there's a lot of competition and a lot of development happening. Maybe we're not here in another 4 years. Like, I got to take my shot. I don't blame any player for just like kind of going into the tournament bubble and being like, I want my chance at the World Cup. I deserve it. And they absolutely do. It's just something that, we're kind of keeping our ears open around. But yeah, definitely a lot of other federations and teams having discussions. Honestly, a lot of them triggered by FIFA doing this kind of like relatively late announcement of, and we're also going to give direct bonuses to the players. And then the federation's going, oh, FIFA's going to pay you bonuses. We don't need to pay you bonuses then. Great. And then the players going, wait, hold on a minute. So.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to just say a few more words about the Haiti-England game. The first thing that stood out to me was Melchi Dumornay, the 19-year-old for Haiti who plays for Lyon, traditionally been the best women's club in the world. And I had never seen her play before that match. And just like, she has to be the best player in the world. Just unbelievable talent in a game where her team was outmatched, was still able to just have these flashes of brilliance and legitimate scoring chances. And this, again, for a team that hasn't been able to play or train in its country. And just, I alluded to it briefly before, but they ended up losing on a penalty, and the penalty ends up getting retaken. And I don't know if you feel this way. It's not just this Women's World Cup. It was the previous, the Men's World Cup as well. I just feel like penalties are given too easily in the VAR era in a sport and in a game where it's so hard to score. There have been just so many examples, Steph, of, where when you zoom in, somebody gets kicked, but it's not an obvious goal-scoring opportunity. They're on the edge of the penalty area, and by the letter of the law, it's a penalty. But, in a bunch of these games, it's just like that's been the margin, and it just doesn't feel like it necessarily represents what you see on the field.
Well, we'll start with Dumornay, which is, I guess she was CONCACAF's best kept secret. If you watch CONCACAF qualifying, and I don't necessarily blame you if you didn't, Dumornay was going off there too. She came out of that qualifying in Monterrey in Mexico, I think, with a pretty decent fan club. And then with VAR and the penalties, this is an ongoing discussion, I think, with VAR, which when it was first discussed about implementing it, I think there was some pushback from people going, this is going to kind of impinge upon like the purity of the sport where, okay, now you can bring it down to like a technically correct robotic decision every single time that there's any kind of question mark. But isn't part of sports like the agony or the ecstasy of like the could have been or the should have been? So I think we are seeing that playing out here at the tournament where maybe people are feeling like, oh, this feels like really clinical. It's removing something like that je ne sais quoi or whatever, that spark or that moment or something that makes sport, like that makes you give your heart over to it and then regret doing that. So unless VAR goes in favor of your team, and then I think you're probably like, it's the best invention that ever happened to this game. Thank goodness.
It slows the game down too much, too. Like, even when the U.S. got its second goal on that VAR decision, it's just like, can we get on? Can we get on with it already? And there is a judgment call on denial of an obvious goal-scoring opportunity, for example, and decide when a ref decides whether to give a red card or not. So there is some subjectivity on that. I feel like a penalty should be given when there's a denial of an obvious goal-scoring opportunity and not otherwise. I don't know if that puts me outside of the mainstream on this issue, but it's just felt like it's distorted a lot of these opening group play games.
It also is doing something which Germany head coach Martina Voss-Tecklenburg noted and which we saw with the men's tournament, which is VAR is adding a lot of time in stoppage. So typically a stoppage will be 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes. And now we're seeing 6, 7, 8, 9 minute stoppages, maybe even longer if something crazy happens, and this is the World Cup. And so she noted by the time you get to a final, you may have added a full extra game onto your players' legs. So this is absolutely impacting the way that players are now having to train and recover. And I think that's going to be kind of where they're looking at next in sports science is, okay, players are going to be carrying an extra 90 minutes on their legs. How do we train for that?
Steph Young writes about soccer for The Athletic. She's in Australia at the moment, covering the Women's World Cup. You can read her at The Athletic and listen to her on the Full-Time podcast. Steph, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Up next, Jonathan Clegg on Lionel Messi's MLS debut. At the end of your first year, Discover credit cards automatically double all the cash back you've earned. That's right. Everything you earned doubled. All the cash back from eating at your favorite soup dumpling restaurant doubled. All the cash back from that trip where you sort of learned to snowboard also doubled. And the best part, you don't have to do anything ridiculous to get it. Nope, Discover does it automatically. Seriously though, see terms and check out for yourself at discover.com/match. On Friday night in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Lionel Messi stepped up to take a free kick in the dying moments of a 1-1 draw between Inter Miami and Cruz Azul. Maybe you saw what happened. If you didn't, maybe you have a sense of what's going to happen. But we're going to play this for you anyway from the call on Apple TV.
Here it is. Messi! Couldn't have been any other way! Magnificent!
So that's how Messi's MLS career began, with a win, a goal, hugs for his family, all in front of David Beckham, LeBron James, Kim Kardashian, and Jonathan Clegg, who is covering the game for the Wall Street Journal. John is also the co-author with Joshua Robinson of Messi versus Ronaldo, One Rivalry, Two Goats, and the Era That Remade the World's Game. John, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to broaden out here in a second, but let's start with that free kick. Tell us what you saw and what you heard in that moment.
You know, it was just a really indelible moment, I think, in the history of, professional soccer in America. And yeah, there's not really much more to say. It was, classic Messi, the same thing that we've seen so many times down the years, just this time dressed in bubblegum pink.
I mentioned in the intro that this game was played in Fort Lauderdale. It's in a stadium that is not the stadium that Inter Miami ultimately wants to be playing in. There are 18,000 people there. So was there a kind of strangeness in that this is not in Miami, it's not in South Beach, it's in the smaller stadium, that it's sort of, and they're selling, some Messi jerseys in the stands, but you have to pre-order the jerseys online. It feels like this is still kind of in formation and incomplete, and not the ultimate form of what Messi and MLS and Inter Miami kind of want this experience to be.
Yeah, that's right. It did. In the moment, obviously, the goal and the significance of it felt enormous. But yes, in a sort of broader sense, everything felt a little makeshift. As you say, that the stadium is small, even by MLS standards. Messi has scored so many of these goals down the years. They've usually come in the sort of cathedrals of European soccer in matches of huge global significance. And there is a sort of, slight disconnect between watching him score the goal and celebrate wildly and with as much enthusiasm as he celebrates all those other goals, and yet the setting, the stakes, everything, it's much less sort of seismic than many of those other goals that he scored down the years. I mean, the last time I saw Lionel Messi in the flesh was in Qatar lifting the World Cup. So there is a sort of slightly sort of bamboozling quality about all that sort of stuff. I guess what Inter Miami and Major League Soccer would say is that, it's moments like that goal that will make a permanent home in Miami more likely. And when that's the case and he's scoring in the sort of newly built stadium there, everything will have been worth it.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly elevated the event and arguably the league to his level in that game, like creating a moment, maybe the most indelible moment in the history of Major League Soccer. I mean, I'm trying not to, have recency bias here, but it's hard to think of another example. And one of the most interesting things I thought about your piece on the game was the way that you contextualized this around his stated desire, even as he was going to Miami, to go back to Barcelona. That he said in that interview, like, I wanted to go home, right, to go back, but it just wasn't possible. And yet you argue that what he's constructed and what MLS and this club has constructed around him might actually be more comfortable and more familiar to him than going to FC Barcelona in 2023. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, it does seem that the plan for Messi in Miami is basically to get the Barcelona band back together. They've already signed Sergio Busquets and Jordi Alba, longtime teammates of Messi in Barcelona. Busquets especially, as a guy who came through the Barcelona youth team and has played with Messi for better part of 2 decades. They signed the former Barcelona coach, Tata Martino. It sounds like they are going to bring former Barcelona player Luis Suarez to play in Miami very soon. Other former Barcelona players have been linked with going there. And, there's a part of that sort of sounds, very much like, what we've seen from MLS over the years, which is they tend to get a lot of big name players on the downside of their careers and, Messi bringing a bunch of his pals to some sort of early retirement gig in South Florida sounds very much, like what we've witnessed over the last, 15, 20 years from Major League Soccer. On the other hand, I don't think that it's actually a terrible idea, purely because Messi is such a homebody. I think I wrote in the piece that he's, soccer's ultimate creature of habit. This is a guy who went to Barcelona at the age of 13 and was perfectly content to spend his entire career there. I don't think he would have left Barcelona had he not been forced out in the summer of 2021 when he was, essentially laid off by the club because they could no longer afford to pay his wages. So he then went to Paris Saint-Germain, had 2 very forgettable years there where he seemed, for the first season there to be sort of really struggling to wrap his head around the fact that he was no longer in Barcelona. The second season seemed to be built entirely around peaking at the World Cup, which he did not do much on the pitch in Paris, either side of that. He's a guy who just wants to feel very comfortable in his surroundings, lived in the same kind of sleepy neighborhood on the outskirts of Barcelona his entire, career with the club. So I think sort of surrounding him with familiar faces and creature comforts. We know he has a house in Miami already. That is a good way for Major League Soccer to get him to be engaged in the project. And I think that's the key part of this. If Messi's engaged, then I think we're going to see a lot more moments like we saw on Friday night. I think the issue sometimes with these guys coming over, the big European stars, is to what extent they have been engaged. So I think, to that extent, while it may not look like a great sort of like long-term plan for Inter Miami, I think in the short term, an engaged Messi is the best thing that the league and the club could hope for.
Paul Tenorio of The Athletic did a story about Messi's first 10 days with the club, and there's a lot of amusing details in there, such as Messi being in the team group chat and all of the players thinking about different ways to save his phone number in their phone in case they, lose their phone. They want to make sure, they have a pseudonym for him in there. Like Leonardo Campana, the forward asks, does anybody have extra tickets? And Messi goes, how many do you need? He gets there at 7 a.m. He's helping out players in the youth academy, training out. Like, how much of this do you feel like is a kind of orchestrated PR campaign to show that Messi is engaged? And just based on your reporting, you wrote a book about the guy, how much of it does seem like genuine, his level of engagement and the way that he's interacting with his teammates?
I think that one of the sort of strange things about Messi is that he's a very quiet, sort of almost like taciturn character in public. But I think in private, he has shown throughout his career very much a desire to be, central, not just to what happens on the field, but, to the broader sort of goings on at whichever club he happens to be at. And obviously most of the time that was at Barcelona. At the end of his time at Barcelona, he was almost a de facto GM for the team. He was sign off on, he had sort of sign off on player sales, player, acquisitions. Recommended, certain guys that he wanted signed. I think, we told the story in our book, which I don't think had been revealed before, about he pressed the team to sign his Argentina teammate, Angel Di Maria. They sort of earmarked a sum of money to try and make that happen. In the end, it proved difficult to deal with PSG. They couldn't make the deal happen. So they ended up just giving the money to Messi to sort of make up for the fact that they weren't able to bring his pal on board. So he's been very, he's been pulling the strings at these clubs for a long time. It doesn't surprise me that he has sort of swiftly, made himself a central figure to what's happening in Inter Miami. There's absolutely no question in my mind that he has been instrumental in bringing Busquets, Alba, Suarez, his very close friend, to the team. I'm sure Tata Martino was persuaded to join partly because of his relationship with Messi. So, yes, some of that stuff does not surprise me at all. For how long exactly he keeps this up and how long he sort of maintains this level of engagement, I think is the bigger question.
One of the kind of more bizarre moments for me was watching the highlights. Messi comes on the field as a substitute, and like one of the first things that he does is like put, a beautiful through ball into DeAndre Yedlin, who's like, longtime American national team player, no longer kind of the first choice right back for the national team. But you have this kind of combination of, you've got the Busquets and you've got Alba will be on the field with him soon, but then you also have guys like Yedlin. After the game, Messi, in an interview, dedicated the win to a homegrown player from Florida named Ian Frey, who tore his ACL in the game. You've got this guy, Benjamin Cramashi, who's a dual national Argentine-American player. And so what is it like watching this game and this team where you do have this strange combination of like mid-2010s Barcelona and like a U.S. national team like B team or C team or D? I mean, just this kind of strange mix of American players on the field with Messi.
Yeah, it's, yes, very strange. It's sort of like a Ferrari with the back of a Honda Civic. It's a very strange thing to witness. I mean, Messi has played on some very sort of mixed teams. He's played at times with Argentina teams that seemed very dysfunctional. I think of the sort of times when he was coached by Maradona and the Argentina team appeared, sort of completely shambolic, really, in the way they set up for games. So he has played in less than ideal circumstances, but almost his entire life he has been surrounded by players of the absolute highest quality. Even when he went to Barcelona as a 13-year-old, one of the sort of remarkable things about him is that he was surrounded by other world-class all-time greats, even at that age. He was playing in the youth team with Cesc Fabregas, and Busquets was there. Guys who would go on to play for some of the biggest clubs in the world. So I'm sure it will take some getting used to the fact that these guys not just aren't on his wavelength, but oftentimes can't perform the sort of very basic tasks that I'm sure all of his teammates in the past have been able to do. So that's something that's not unique to Messi, though. That has been true for many of the sort of great players who have come to Major League Soccer in the past. I think going back to David Beckham's time with the Galaxy, this was, something that was sort of remarked upon. But I think it's something that he will, invariably get used to. I mean, his whole life he's been the best player on the pitch. So, in some ways, he's sort of been having to deal with this to some degree for his whole career.
Yeah, and for these players, it's an opportunity potentially to get better. Maybe they'll be inspired or learn or just feel the pressure to raise their games. It's an opportunity to get more publicity, maybe get noticed and get the attention that perhaps they would have deserved. It's also an opportunity to get replaced by some of Messi's friends and be off the squad. So you'll have to just see what plays out. I wanted to circle back to something that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, which is this notion of elevating the game, elevating the league. And you said in your piece that even MLS Commissioner Don Garber has struggled to articulate exactly what he hopes that Messi's arrival will achieve. If the commissioner has a hard time articulating it, I don't want to force you to explain. But what do you think elevating MLS or elevating the game in America might look like? What are some potential goals here?
I think, in one aspect, he's already done that. I mean, Inter Miami against Cruz Azul in a Leagues Cup game is not something that anyone in America would have heard about were it not for the fact that Lionel Messi played in the game and scored the winning goal, and it was all over SportsCenter and Twitter and wherever else people, consume their media these days. So I think part of it is that. Part of it is he will sort of...
But there's a curiosity factor with the first game. What's going to happen when they have the same fixture next year?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think if he keeps banging in last-minute winning goals, from the edge of the box, then they'll probably those highlights are probably still going to be everywhere, because that's the nature of these things. When Messi does something incredible, it travels all over the world very quickly. But yes, I take your point. The newness, the curiosity will wear off. I think it's a question about, and I sort of have puzzled over this myself, is like, what is the goal here? Messi has not come to America to save Major League Soccer, because Major League Soccer doesn't need saving. Major League Soccer is already a sort of perfectly, strong league. Like I think I wrote in the piece that its attendances are, sort of top 7, 8 among all the soccer leagues in the world. It has 29 clubs, none of which are, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, which is more than can be said for many clubs in the so-called strongest leagues in Europe. It has a pretty good series of broadcast deals. MLS is one of the top, certainly dozen leagues in the world. Like, what its sort of ultimate goal is, that's harder to say, but what is the goal of the Portuguese league? What is the goal of the Dutch league? What is the goal of the French league? I think, for all these leagues, it's to make the league as sort of strong and deliver as compelling a product as they possibly can. And I think, to that extent, having Lionel Messi in the league has already strengthened, MLS.
And you can't argue with the timing. I mean, Copa America 2024 in the U.S., totally. The World Cup in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico in 2026. I mean, it seems like a bunch of things are converging. If you want to make some broader argument about the sport in America and this opportunity to grow things, like, this would be the time.
Absolutely. And I think, the other thing is maybe, does Messi being here sort of help MLS's footprint in South America? It's long been suggested that for MLS to really grow stronger as a league, maybe maybe its best avenue would be to look to South America, where they have many, many talented players, but money and the facilities aren't exactly there. MLS has the other problem. The money and facilities are here, but sometimes the players aren't as strong. So could, Messi's presence here, I think there was, some fanciful suggestions that, could MLS somehow wangle its way out of the CONCACAF Champions League and join the Copa Libertadores in South America, where their teams would then play against Boca Juniors and River Plate and the giants of South America. Whether or not that's possible, feasible, legal under FIFA laws, I must admit I'm not entirely sure, but like those sorts of things would make sense as a way to really kind of leverage Messi's presence here. And I think, already the fact that Messi's debut was such a, celebration for Miami's sort of Latino fan base, and MLS sort of strengthening its, relationship with those fans, again, is a strong result from this.
Jonathan Clegg writes about soccer and other sports for the Wall Street Journal. He's also the co-author with Joshua Robinson of Messi versus Ronaldo, One Rivalry, Two Goats, and the Era That Remade the World's Game. John, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Up next, the Wall Street Journal's Jason Gay on the Tour de France.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you're driving, cooking, or doing laundry, Progressive knows the podcasts you listen to go best when they're bundled with another activity, much like how their Progressive home and auto policies go best when they're bundled. Having these two policies together makes taking care of your insurance easier and could help you save too. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. That's a whole lot of savings and protection for your favorite podcast listening activities, like going on a road trip, cooking dinner, and even hitting the gym. Yep, your home and your car are even easier to protect when you bundle your insurance together. Find your perfect combo. Get a home and car insurance quote at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
Get a new Apple Card account by July 25th and get 10% back on App Store purchases for your first 6 months. Up to $100 daily cash. Terms apply. You can earn on games like Candy Crush Saga and Roblox, subscriptions like Apple TV Plus, in-app purchases, and all the good stuff. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone. Subject to credit approval, 10% daily cash earned and up to a maximum of $1,000 in qualifying purchases. Is valid only for the first 180 days for new Apple Card accounts opened between July 11th and July 25th. To make a qualifying purchase, your new Apple Card must be set as the default payment method for the Apple ID associated with your Apple account in the App Store. You must have a zero balance on all digital Apple accounts associated with your Apple ID. Visit apple.co/App Store for more important offer details. On Sunday in Paris, Jonas Vingegaard paraded down the Champs-Élysées, having slayed all of his rivals metaphorically. Would have been cooler if it wasn't metaphorically. Nevertheless, the 26-year-old Dane, a former fishmonger, won his second Tour de France, this one with a rout over his Slovenian rival today, Pogačar. Jason Gay was following them and the whole cycling carnival around France. He's the sports and humor columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and he's got a book of essays called I Wouldn't Do That If I Were Me. Jason, welcome.
Hey, thank you very much. You need to have a sports and humor sensibility to cover the Tour de France, so I felt like I might have been the man for the job.
A week ago, you published a piece about how amazing this tour was, exciting, nip and tuck, only a few seconds separating the sports to rail-thin titans. But in the end, it was, in your words, a soul-crushing smackdown. So What happened?
I put a hex on it. Can there be any other example? Look, this was 2 weeks of some of the most exciting Tour de France racing we've seen. And I should clarify for the people who aren't nutball obsessives like I am that the Tour de France is the ultimate example of the play within the play. It is a drama that takes place on individual stages, winners of individual stages. But the main thing, the yellow jersey, the championship, the thing people remember is what's called the general classification, which is the total time in aggregate. You want to have the least amount of time over those 3 weeks. So we finished 2 weeks of this tour with 10 seconds separating the two of them. I write, maybe this is the greatest tour of all time. And then within 48 hours, it beefs up to almost 8 minutes and is this one-sided defeat for the rest of the tour. So yes, it's on me.
So there was just an amazing performance in a time trial by Vingegaard, and then another just kind of blowout in the Alps. And you, I think, argued that this might have actually been a kind of rope-a-dope strategy, that it was close because Vingegaard and his team wanted it to be, or just didn't want to expend the energy. Is that kind of what you think?
What has been suspected is that his team, Jumbo-Visma, which is kind of the LA Dodgers of professional cycling, they go out and they get the best talent, they spend the most. They are a team that sort of circled that third week, in particular the time trial, which was last Tuesday, and a big critical mountain stage the day following on Wednesday as being sort of the integral moments of this tour. And so all that was necessary for them to make their move was to sort of keep it close with Pogačar, which they did. They had a 10-second advantage. But I don't think anybody expected it to shake out the way that it did, including Jumbo-Visma. I don't think anyone thought that Vingegaard, who was a stellar time trialist, a guy who has shown himself capable of winning these stages in the past, would be able to put, and this is when they race against the clock, would be able to put close to 2 minutes on Pogačar, who was the second placed rider. So he put 2 minutes on Pogačar, 3 to 20 minutes on his competition behind that. It was a spectacular result some people are saying it's the greatest time trial anyone's ever seen. I don't know how you compete with when you had the Greg LeMond finale into Paris in 1989, of course. But then you was followed up by this really, really epic mountain stage on Wednesday in which, as Vingegaard climbed and climbed and climbed, the thing that occasionally happens in the sport, and what makes it great, but also incredibly cruel, Pogacar hit the wall. He just bonked. And he started to pedal basically backwards. And on that day, Vingegaard gained about 5 minutes. And so you were left with this, this margin that was just no longer a margin. It was an epic victory for a guy who had won the Tour the year before. This rivalry, which we thought was incredibly joined, is clearly Vingegaard is the class of it, or at least was the class of it in this year's event.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody, and I can say this because you said it about yourself, as somebody who's like a cycling psychotic, you will know that Pogacar is like doing all these other races prior to the Tour de France. And there's some speculation that, okay, maybe if he was just singularly focused on the Tour, maybe he would have done more prep. Maybe he wouldn't have broken his wrist or hurt his wrist, whatever happened. But you feel like, no, he should actually be doing all of these other races, that the sport is about more than just this one singular event. But is there an argument that it's not about Vingegaard being better, that it's about him maybe having a richer team and having better teammates and maybe having done better prep?
Sure, absolutely. I think those are all factors. I think the fact that he has this well-equipped team, he has superstar teammates, and he had a calendar that was very, very focused on getting this result in July, I think was all added to it. I don't think anyone on that team would disagree. But what makes Pogacar, and what makes him sort of one of the more charismatic riders in the sport, maybe one of the most charismatic riders we've seen in a long time, is that he's sort of broken the mold of these general classification yellow jersey specialists, these people who are kind of all in from day one on the calendar to get that result in July in Paris. And we'll try a lot of things and we'll throw stuff against the wall, and he will do these, very epic one-day races in early April, which come with a great degree of risk, but also are beautiful, incredible, not as important, but close to as important as the Tour races, including winning this year at the Tour of Flanders, which, if you took any cyclist and asked them if they would want to win the Tour de France or the Tour of Flanders, most would say the Tour de France, but I guarantee you there'll be a few that say Flanders. That was an incredible result for him. But yes, does it take away from his ability to focus on the Tour? Does it increase risk? As we saw, he actually did have a crash in a race following that and have 6 weeks of rehabilitation. Yes. But I think that's kind of what makes him him. And I would be loath to tell him to do it otherwise. But I guarantee you there will be people who will argue, look, just for a couple of years, if you want to win the yellow jersey again, and he's won 2. Remember, he won 2020, 2021. You got to focus.
Yeah. You said in one of your journal pieces that Pogacar said, "I'm dead," which is a rather candid admission when he bonked, as you said. You also said that in the post-race, he grinned as he said it, adding a more colorful term. I'll skip here. You're allowed to curse on this show, Jason. So yeah. Tell people who read your Bowdlerized Wall Street Journal column, what did he actually say?
Well, it's a post-race interview, and I think they go to him, and he's very, pale and exhausted looking, saucers under his eyes, and they say, "Tade, how are you feeling?" And he goes, "Fucked. I'm dead." Now, I think in theory, I'm allowed to say that in the Wall Street Journal now. I think there's been some style changes with regard to coarse language. I just didn't feel
only if a Slovenian says it. Actually.
Yeah, I think that's right. I didn't want it to be too much of a distraction, especially in a headline. But yes, he said that. And it kind of speaks to the charm of the guy that he has always been pretty candid about his assessing his successes and failures. Clearly, that day was one of the worst days he's ever had on a bike, if not the worst. And to say that he was ducked was pretty funny.
So you were following the race. How do you actually follow the Tour de France as a reporter? Like, where are you? What are you doing? And how do you see what's going on?
Well, you join a team. It's kind of hopeless. I mean, it's an incredible exercise in terms of just the logistics of a Tour de France. You're talking about, 100-mile stages throughout the country of France for 3 weeks, stretching in this case from the Grand Depart, and in the Pyrenees, coming over to the Alps, then into Paris. I mean, you're all over the place in this race. And so you see much less of it than if you were sitting at home back in the States watching it on television. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Now you can go to press centers and things like that and watch it. But what I like to do, and I'm with my colleague Josh Robinson from the Journal, who's fluent in French, lives in Paris. He's my, entry into everything. Pick out some strategic stages, some places where we think stuff is going to happen that could change the race. And we really lucked out this time. We were in place for that time trial, in place for that mountain stage the following day, called the Little O's, and just had a great time seeing the race turn. I mean, again, because it's like, you're talking about, in the end, it's something like on the order of 100 hours of racing, and you can be there for those momentary minutes that change everything is pretty special.
It's hard to necessarily stack things in an order, but it's always struck me that just standing in a particular spot for a bike race might be the worst sports viewing experience on earth. Do you disagree?
I do disagree in that if you're thinking of a sporting experience, a sports viewing experience, and let's just sort of take the sports writer hat off for a second and just speak as a member of the sports going public. If you view it strictly within the prism of like, I want to see exactly what happens in the event, yes. But if you view it in terms of an actual experience, an actual kind of thing to take your family to, an actual thing that you will remember in your life, I find it's really way, way up there. I don't think there's much that compares. The Tour de France in terms of its, what it means to France, what it means in terms of where it goes in the world, the places that it visits, the vibe, the energy of the crowds, the food, the wine, the whole just thing around it. No all-star game, no Super Bowl, frankly, can compare with the immersive sort of joy of what it's like to be, especially in something like a mountain stage. There's nothing like it. Josh and I talked about this a great deal. Yes, you do not watch this thing minute to minute. It is an inferior product in terms of watching what actually happens on the course. But in terms of what you will remember, things that you will look up from your bed and say, I remember I was there, it's right up there.
All right, I want to talk about this Netflix series, Tour de France Unchained is the English title. And I was asking you yesterday, like, oh, all right, we're talking about this. Which episode should I watch? And you're like, you know what? They're all like, whichever one you want. They're all like B+. Shots fired from Jason Gay. So it's made by some of the same people who did Formula One Drive to Survive, similar kind of vibe, similar intention to kind of introduce the sport, it feels like, to people who are not hardcore fans like you. So I guess two questions. Are you able to step outside of yourself and evaluate how it performs on that metric? Do you feel like it's a good introduction? And how did, just as you, Jason Kay, how did you enjoy or not enjoy the series?
So you're like saying, can you rate this as a lunatic and as a non-lunatic?
Yes.
Well, let me deal with the non-lunatic part of it. I think it's absolutely great that they did it. I mean, versus not doing it, anything that cultivates interest and especially reaches down and tries to grab the casual viewer and explain what is a very complicated sport, candidly, I think is really good.
Beautifully shot, clearly, like a huge amount of investment went into this.
A tremendous amount. And I actually know quite a good many people. That's a good point. That watch the Tour de France for the vibes, for the visuals. They just like seeing castles and farms and tractors and stuff like that. As an actual piece of documentary about the 2022 tour, I found it wanting a little bit. They really kind of missed, for some strange reasons, the relationship between Pogačar and Vingegaard, which is a really interesting relationship. And they missed some sort of consequential parts of the race, in particular important descent where they both are, one wiped out and one nearly wiped out, and they call it a truce, which is something you almost never see in sports. It just didn't exist in the Netflix. Part of the reason Pogačar did not participate, Pogačar's team, UAE, did not participate with Netflix. So it was one case of like, we're kind of letting the relationships determine the telling of the story, which I guess is sort of normal. But I felt, man, you had this incredible thing happen and you didn't get into it at all. I think they made a little too much hay of the rivalry within the team of Vingegaard and his associate Wout van Aert, who is sort of his consigliere, but also a guy who's capable of winning stages himself. I mean, there was...
And your personal hero.
The typical, yes, one of my personal heroes. I have many, but the some of the typical stuff that these are common documentary grievances. The net of it, and by the way, speaking as a C+ student, B+ is not a criticism. Okay, I stand by that. I don't think it's gonna, it's not going to change the game like Drive to Survive did, which I feel was a sort of lightning in a bottle, pandemic craziness too. But I do think it's absolutely a good thing for the sport. And I've heard from a great many cycling fans who were moved by it.
Yeah, they did a good job of just giving you a visceral feel of a sport where it's often hard to tell, I think, watching, even if you watch the TV coverage. It's a lot of like overhead shots where it's just this, it looks like this kind of slow moving pack. Like you get a sense of how dangerous it is, how fast they're moving.
You do. Just if I can add one quick thing, Nielsen Pallas, who's an American writer who was featured in the documentary as well, writes for a team called EF Education, said to me, it did a great job of underlining the team nature of competitive bike racing, which I think is something that gets lost a lot, that people think it's just an individual sport, people racing the fastest up the hills. That's not what it's all about. The team part of it is a little hard to explain, but I think they did a really great job of that.
Yeah, and there was a lot more mucus than I was expecting, to be honest. Like you get also a sense of like kind of how disgusting it is and how brutal the sport is. I mean, it's one thing to say he bonked. It's another thing to see it in super close up and watch. I mean, people say that the sport is cruel, and that word can mean a couple different things. It can mean like, oh, it's harsh. It's like sad when you lose, but like it's cruel in terms of what they actually make these people do. In tennis, which is a sport that can be difficult physically, you get like a day off between matches in a Grand Slam. In soccer, you like run around for 90 minutes and then you play again the next week. That they make these guys do this like every day for 3 weeks with just a couple rest days and literally ride up a mountain. Ridiculous.
It is.
And you can understand why they take PEDs. But this like made me kind of understand that and feel that maybe more than I had before.
No, I was about to say that what you were driving at there is an explanation that a lot of people had for the culture of performance enhancement in the sport. And that when efforts were being made to clean up cycling, efforts which are still ongoing, and no one should assume that the sport is utterly clean. But one thing that got raised again and again was, should we just make the sport easier? We don't have to race 200 kilometers every single day. We don't have to race up 23% climbs at the end of every mountain stage. Maybe make it a little bit easier and give these guys an opportunity to recover. I should mention that at the same time, we also have a women's tour underway right now. The Women's Tour de France began on Sunday, and so same questions abound there.
Pogacar reportedly will be in season 2. There is going to be a season 2.
Oh, good to hear.
Series, like you said, there were kind of negotiations around it. I saw this interview with one of the producers that was in Outside Magazine, and he said that I think that Pogacar, like they wanted some sort of different treatment than the other teams got, and so they were like, no, we're not going to include you. I don't know if that's actually true, but reportedly he will be, and his team will be in season 2. I wanted to end with a question about a headline people might have seen, tension over beer claim. Do you know what I'm referring to, Jason?
Yes, I do.
Explain to people what tension over beer claim means in reference to the 2023 Tour de France.
Okay, I read a quick story on this, so I'm going to paraphrase it. Maybe I'll get parts of it wrong, but my understanding is that the Jumbo-Visma team personnel saw personnel with other teams, in particular a French team, consuming alcoholic beverages in the final week of the race, including
large beers.
Large beers. Is there any other way? But drinking before these critical time trial and mountain stages, and showing and basically inferring that implying that this is an indication of their unseriousness and lack of results in the Tour. And let me tell you, those beer drinking French did not like any of that. The gloves are off.
It's an exceptionally vile attack on his part, said Groupama FDJ team manager Mark Mattia. If you're not drinking beer, a large beer after riding up a mountain for 150 kilometers, then what are you even doing, Jason?
But it speaks to a little bit of the tension that's been created in the sport over the last sort of half generation, which is sort of like, as the sport has become obsessed with the marginal gains, they have sort of, I've heard it characterized this way, they've taken things off the table. First went the bread, then went the, cookies, then went the wine. The wine was really a terrible thing to go, especially for the French teams. And that it has become sort of this very technocratic, like, kind of dry sport. And when people are lashing out at Jumbo saying like, this is a vile accusation, I mean, I think what they're saying between the lines is like, you know what? These guys have to be able to live a little bit too.
Jason Gay is a sports and humor columnist, maybe the sports and humor columnist. I should check myself, for the Wall Street Journal. He's also got a book coming out. I wouldn't do that if I were me. Jason, thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
What's up? It's Kaylee Cuoco. When it comes to travel, we all have a happy place. I just went to my happy place. I just went to Maui, and it was truly amazing. Priceline has always been about getting you to your happy place for a happy price, with deals you really can't find anywhere else. Like up to 60% off select hotels in Costa Rica, or 5-star hotels for 2-star prices in Cabo.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Now it is time for Afterballs. You heard me rhapsodizing about the Haitian soccer star Melchi Dumornay during our Women's World Cup segment. I will now honor her further by noting that her nickname is Corventina, which she got from her older brother. So Melchi, Corventina, we salute you, and we'll be watching.
Josh, what is your Corventina?
Thank you, Kevin. You know that thing, Kevin, and America and the world, where you learn a new word and then you can't stop seeing it or hearing it. A Stanford linguistics professor named Arnold Zwicky calls it the frequency illusion. And in a letter to the St. Paul Pioneer Press, a guy named Terry Mullen called it the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, because immediately after he first heard about the Baader-Meinhof terrorist group, he had a friend call him up and start talking about the Baader-Meinhof terrorist group. Anyway, I got Baader-Meinhofed myself, not in the terrorist sense. In the last couple of days, I learned a new word from my friend James Carmichael's newsletter, the B&T. And then as I was looking through my folder of Afterball ideas, I saw that word again, a word I could swear I had never heard of or seen before a couple of days ago.
What is conation? It sounds familiar, but it isn't. It is defined in a book called The 1,000 Most Obscure Words in the English Language as the area of one's mentality that has to do with desire, volition, and striving. In other words, the will to win.
It does sound familiar. Thank you, the late Dick Schaap, defining the word conation. He's doing it on a 1990 segment from the ABC Evening News. I'd come across an intriguing description of that clip earlier this year and filed it away. It said that the Phoenix Suns, around 1990, had hired a consultant named Kathy Kolbe who developed a system to determine an athlete's will to win. But it was only just now, today, that I found an actual clip of the segment on Facebook with Dick Schaap's definition of conation. And here's what I've learned about Kathy Kolbe. She is the daughter of a man named Eldon Wunderlich. If that last name sounds familiar, it's because Eldon Wunderlich is the inventor and namesake of the Wunderlich test, a 50-question cognitive exam created in the 1930s that most famously was administered to NFL players at the annual scouting combine starting in the 1970s. In recent years, that test has come under a lot of criticism, including apparently from Wunderlich's own daughter. In a 2015 story published on CBSSports.com, Kathy Kolbe said, "Cognitive testing has a history of being used in ways that are biased. And my father did everything he could to try to prevent that from happening. But with any cognitive test, it's testing the level of education you've received. So people who have lived in a culture where they had better schools and more money available for tutoring score better on cognitive tests. And therefore, disadvantaged young men who come into the league might score lower, but not because they aren't as smart." In that same CBS Sports story, Kolbe says that before his death, her father urged her to develop her own testing methods. What are those methods? Let's go back to Dick Schaap in 1990.
Kolbe's test simply shows whether a person is primarily one of four types: a quick start, who is a risk taker; a fact finder, who plays the percentages; a follow-through, who sticks to the game plan; or an implementer, who is instinctive and physical.
What Dick Schaap was just describing is called the Kolbe Conative Index, Conative, conation. And the big takeaway from that ABC News segment was that its findings had led the Phoenix Suns to draft one player in particular.
She'd never seen Dan Marley play, had no idea if he was left-handed, right-handed, tall or short, or anything about him. But she evaluated his test and said, this guy has heart, and he'll be a great player if he has any skill at all. And he's been exactly what she said he would be, the toughest guy on the floor every night he goes out there.
That was then Suns assistant coach Paul Westphal talking about Dan Marley, a.k.a. Thunder Dan, who had a pretty excellent 14-year career in the NBA. Conation, baby. A 1994 Washington Post story said it wasn't just the Phoenix Suns using the Kolbe Conative Index, that corporations including Intel, AT&T, Honeywell, and Motorola were into it too. And then, after that list of corporations, here's the following sentence in that Post story. Meanwhile, skeptics in the business world criticize it as a far-flung management gimmick that makes much ado about very little. Scientists who attack it argue it's pseudoscientific, like some kind of business management horoscope. Now, 30 years later, despite Thunder Dan averaging a career-high 17 points per game for the Suns in 91-92, the Kolbe Conative Index is not the be-all, end-all of sports evaluation. As noted previously, I had never heard of it, and I'm guessing you have not either. In that same CBS Sports article I mentioned earlier, Kathy Kolbe claims she met with the NFL sometime in the 2000s to encourage them to adopt her testing methods instead of her father's outdated Wonderlic test. But she said that the NFL asked her to speak at their Wives Association instead, which she described as one of the most sexist things I've ever been told. All right, what have we learned? That conation has to do with desire, volition, and striving. That if you're like me, you're going to see the word conation everywhere, starting right about now. And that I am definitely not an implementer, given that I'm neither instinctive or physical. I will leave that to Thunder Dan. That's our show for today. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. I'm Josh Levin. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.
When I play the new Pick 5 from the Virginia Lottery, I use my dogs to pick my numbers. They come running and I count them up. Looks like 4. Is that 6? No, down, Ginger!
Win up to $50,000. Play in-store, in-app, or online today. Visit VALottery.com/pick5.
When I play the new Pick 5 from the Virginia Lottery, I use my dogs to pick my numbers. They come running and I count them up. Looks like 4. Is that 6? No, down, Ginger!
Win up to $50,000. Play in-store, in-app, or online today. Visit VALottery.com/pick5.